We don our political wetsuits and dive deep into the tumultuous waters of democracy, not just to explore the past, but to confront a pressing question that resonates with the very essence of our times: the fear of losing and how it has brought us to a precipice. Picture a nation just emerging from the shadows of a political regime that had long cast its ominous pall over its people. It's the 30th of October, 1983, and the atmosphere in Argentina crackles with electric tension. As the votes are meticulously counted, Peronists gather in their Buenos Aires campaign bunker, their nerves taut like piano strings. For decades, they had been the unchallenged champions, guardians of the working class, but tonight is an aberration. Anxiously, they inquire about the votes from the industrial heartland, unable to fathom the tectonic shift unfolding before their eyes. The Peronists, a political powerhouse, a party synonymous with the Argentine politics since the day of the indomitable Juan Perón, are about to be hit with a seismic transformation, the likes of which they never envisioned. The force of change had swept through Argentina, erasing Perón's legacy, corroding the industrial base, and ushering in a new diverse electorate craving a different vision. In the midst of these shifting sands, the Peronists clung stubbornly to their old guard, selecting candidates out of sync with the nation's evolving pulse. Their final campaign rally, a mere 2 days before the election, turned into a grotesque spectacle as a candidate set ablaze a casket bearing the symbol of their rival, an act as shocking as it was horrifying, especially to a nation scarred by years of brutal repression. When early results spelled a different narrative, Peronist leaders wavered at the precipice of denial, clutching to the hope that uncounted votes from their stronghold would change the course of destiny. But the truth struck hard. They had lost. Yet, this is where democracy unveils its indomitable spirit. The Peronists did not reject the results. They accepted the bitter pill of defeat and embarked on a path of self-rejection and adaptation. A new faction, the Renewal, emerged, advocating for a revitalized Peronism that could bridge divides and resonate with a broader electorate. But Argentina's story is just one chapter in the grand narrative of democracy, a narrative that stretches across continents and centuries. In the United States, a storm of democracy's making is brewing. In 1801, America ventured into uncharted territory, an unprecedented experiment of transferring power peacefully from one political party to another. It was a leap of faith fraught with danger. The Federalists, guardians of the nascent republic, found themselves locked in battle with the Democratic Republicans, the nation's first opposition party. The escalating animosity reached fever pitch, with accusations of treason and conspiracy. The Alien and Sedition Acts were weaponized, imprisoning political adversaries and setting the nation ablaze with unrest. As the 1800 election loomed, the specter of violence and civil war loitered over America. Mistrust festered, threatening to shatter the fragile democratic dream. Historian James Sharp aptly captured the era where Federalists and Republicans believed that their opponents were capable of any treacherous act to seize or cling to power. Now fast forward to today, where we find ourselves navigating treacherous waters once more. Former President Donald J. Trump, with 91 criminal indictments looming ominously over his head, has made an audacious promise of retribution should he be elected to another term as president. It is a stark reminder that the fear of losing can drive political leaders to the brink of dismantling the very democracy they claim and swear to cherish and uphold. Tonight, we embark on a journey through history and democracy's darkest hours, connecting the dots to the present. We delve deep into the heart of America's democracy and ask whether it's standing on the precipice, teetering under the weight of fear and division. And the ever-evolving landscape of U.S. democracy, a stark warning from acclaimed authors Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt rings alarmingly true. One of the nation's political parties has taken a troubling turn away from democratic principles. What's even more alarming is their revelation that key enablers of this backslide, known as semi-loyalists, not only tolerate but actively embrace anti-democratic extremists within their party ranks. The burning question on everyone's mind is, why is this unsettling shift occurring? Levitsky and Ziblatt, in their latest book, Tyranny of the Minority, a New York Times bestseller, point to a crucial factor, the role of the Constitution itself. Join us as we unravel the intricate threads of this complex issue on today's episode 119 of the Political Mike Podcast. Professor Levitsky, thank you so much for being a part of the Political Mike Podcast this evening.
Thanks for having me back, Mike.
It's fascinating how you draw parallels between Argentina's political transformation in your book and the current state of American politics. Do you mind elaborating on the key lessons that we can learn from Argentina's history and how they apply to our situation?
Well, we use you did a nice summary of what happened in Argentina in 1983, but we use it as an example of how political parties are supposed to behave in a democracy. Losing, nobody likes losing. No political party likes losing, especially political parties that are accustomed to winning a lot, like the Peronists. But there's no democracy in the world where parties don't lose elections. And so in a democracy, parties are supposed to do what the Peronists did, which is lick their wounds, go home, cry a little bit, scream and shout, maybe have a few drinks, and then get up the next day, accept defeat, maybe congratulate your rival, and then go and do the work of figuring out how to win next time, which usually, if you've just lost, means thinking about how to broaden your appeal and broaden your coalition so you can win the next time around. And that's what the Peronists did. And in fact, the next presidential election, they found a way to win. What concerns us, the reason why we use this example, is that the Republican Party has behaved so differently since losing the 2020 election. Not only have they not only did they not accept defeat, at least not its top leaders immediately, but they haven't gone back and thought, okay, how can we broaden our appeal so that the Republican Party can once again win a majority of votes in the United States? Instead, they've doubled down on a strategy of extremism and radicalism, and that is troubling for our democracy.
In your book, The Tyranny of the Minority, you paint a vivid picture of the current state of American democracy. Can you explain what led you to write this book? Of course, it's a sequel to the book we've discussed on this platform before, How Democracies Die. What led you to write this book, and why do you believe we're at a breaking point?
Well, we wrote How Democracies Die because Daniel and I studied democracies and democratic breakdown in other parts of the world. Daniel in interwar Europe, me in Latin America in the 20th century. And as with the election, with the rise of and the election of Trump, and with the Republican Party's unwillingness to serve as democratic gatekeepers and distance themselves from Trump, we saw patterns that we'd seen before. We felt like looking at 2016 in the United States, we had seen this movie before and it didn't end well. So How Democracies Die kind of described this process of democratic weakening and democratic breakdown so that Americans could see the warning signs. And so it basically described this process of democratic breakdown. But afterwards, we got a lot of questions over and over and over again after the publication of How Democracies Die. What do we do? And so this second book is an effort, first of all, to dive more deeply into what happened and to understand why things got so off the rails, but also to think about what steps we as Americans can take to prevent it from happening again, to put our democracy on more solid footing.
The book also delves into the emergence of the Renovación faction in Argentina's Peronist Party. Could you share some insights on how this renewal process occurred and whether you see any potential for a similar transformation within the American political parties, particularly the Republican Party?
That's a good question. I mean, again, this is normally what we see. When parties lose, when parties take an electoral drubbing, you generally see the emergence of a new faction saying, hey, we can't keep doing things the old way. We've got to rethink parts of our platform. We need fresh blood. We need fresh faces, and to present a different project to the electorate. So after the Democrats lost 3 presidential elections in a row in the 1980s, we saw the emergence of the so-called New Democrats, Bill Clinton, Al Gore, and other figures. Like them or not, they presented a different vision, a critique of some of the electoral failures of the Democrats in earlier years, and presented a set of new faces, attached to a new strategy. And it helped them win elections in the 1990s. Same thing with Blairism and the Labour Party in Britain. And that's what we need to see, ideally, in the Republican Party. We need to see a faction in the Republican Party emerge and say, look, Trumpism, MAGA is not a winning strategy. MAGA has never won a majority of votes in the United States. It's never been supported by a majority of Americans. We need a new vision. I think given the demographics of the United States, given the social realities of the United States in the 21st century, that will have to be a faction that positions itself as much more multi-ethnic and much more diverse than MAGA. It is the end of the road in terms of democratic politics. It is the end of the road for any political force that paints itself as exclusively white and Christian in the United States.
It's Constitution Day today, and I'm so grateful to be able to have you on a day like this, Professor. In the book, you also talk about the election of 1800 and how significant of an event the transfer of power was from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson. But you also acknowledge that there was a flaw in the Constitution that allows there to be what you call semi-loyalists that make room for demagogues like Donald Trump. Could you elaborate on what that flaw in the Constitution is and what's the solution to it? And if you can also shed some light on the significance of the 1800 election.
The 1800 election was significant because, as you mentioned in your introduction, this is really the first time that that we see the emergence of a real opposition. Prior to the 19th century, the 18th century, when the United States was founded, the idea that there could be a legitimate, loyal, legal opposition was very new and was not widely accepted. Even our founders were not comfortable with the idea of a legitimate opposition. And so the idea that a political party would move into opposition, compete against you, win, and that you would cede power to them was a very, very new, very frightening idea for the founding Federalist leaders. And so and it was a touch and go for weeks after the 1800 election, as you nicely described. But eventually, our politicians did the right thing, and that was the first legal transfer, electoral transfer of power, really in the modern world, certainly in the United States. And it helped to establish a set of norms that existed really pretty stably for a couple of centuries. It became, within a few decades, it became commonplace, normal, expected that when you lose an election, you pack up your things and you leave office. Now, the Constitution is a brilliant document. It is the oldest constitution, the oldest continuous constitution in the world today. It was incredibly successful in many, many ways. But as George Washington and the other framers themselves recognized, it had a bunch of flaws. It didn't have just one flaw. It had a bunch of flaws. There was one flaw that helped to create the crisis of 1800, which is that allowed for the separate election of presidents and vice presidents, which allowed for this sort of tie situation that created the crisis of 1800. But it included a slew of flaws that we as Americans have been working ever since 1787 to correct. We've been working as a country for more than 200 years to constantly improve our Constitution, amend our Constitution, or amend our laws in ways that make our system more democratic. So it started just 2 years after the passage of the Constitution with the Bill of Rights. It continued with the incredibly important Reconstruction amendments following the Civil War, which were not all put into practice, but on paper were lay the initial foundation for a multiracial democracy. It included the set of reforms in the progressive era that included the expansion of suffrage to women, and obviously the set of legal rulings and reforms in the mid 20th century that actually completed our transition to democracy by bringing the suffrage and civil rights to all American citizens. The thing is, in the last half century, really since the late 60s, for the first time, Americans have stopped doing the work of thinking about how to make our system more democratic. We've become stuck. We've really, for most of us who are alive today, we are not accustomed to thinking about, well, how can we make our system more democratic? How can we amend the Constitution to make it better? We've kind of stopped doing that and started to act as if it's an untouchable, unreformable document. And I think that's really dangerous for democracy.
In your book, Professor, you say that according to nearly every major social scientific account, what makes democracies thrive. America should have been immune to backsliding. Scholars have discovered two virtually law-like patterns regarding modern political systems. Rich democracies never die, and old democracies never die. And both history and decades of social science research tells us that American democracy should have been saved. Why is that?
Well, it hasn't broken down yet. The 2020, the Trump presidency, the 2020 election, the effort to overturn the election, the violence associated with that posed a severe threat to our democracy. I think it's fair to say that the United States has experienced a degree of democratic backsliding over the last 5 or 6 years, to the point where one of the leading international indexes of democracy, Freedom House, now scores Argentina as more democratic than the United States. But our democracy at some basic level remains intact. And the fact that we did manage to defeat and remove Donald Trump from the presidency in 2020 is extraordinarily important. That said, as you imply, our democracy continues to be under threat. We're far from out of the woods. There is a risk of democratic erosion, backsliding, maybe breakdown in the United States that is way out of whack with our level of wealth and the age of our democracy. Even if you date the birth of American democracy at 1965, which I think is a defensible position, we're still more than 50 years old as a democracy. No democracy over the age of 50 has ever broken down. So why are we under threat? Our view, or my view, is that the United States has entered uncharted terrain in the following sense. There's never been a democracy in which a founding and once dominant ethnic majority loses that majority and loses its dominant status. That is an entirely new phenomenon for democracies in the world, and it's an incredibly threatening and challenging thing, if I can overgeneralize, to white Christians in this country, and that has radicalized the base of the Republican Party in a way that, and to a degree, that I think very few of us anticipated, or certainly I didn't anticipate.
You mentioned that one of the conditions of accepting defeat is accepting the notion that the nation would not fall under collapse under the opposition party. And when we look at the polls today, when you poll Democrats, they believe that the Republicans are a major threat to the United States. And when you poll Republicans, they believe that the Democrats are a major threat to the United States. And then you have the former president promising retribution, promising to revamp the FBI and fill it with political loyalists. Even in his interview with Kristen Welker yesterday, and asked about whether he would retaliate against those who he views as political enemies, he said, well, I have to. How are we to restore the notion that all will not be lost to the governing hands of the opposition party if these are the stakes at play?
That's a great question. And I think if I knew the answer, I'd have a better paying job. Look, you're right. I mean, you point to one of the great threats of our democracy, which is extreme partisan polarization. You're right. Both sides, both parties now view one another as an existential threat. And whenever that's the case, democracy is going to be fragile. Is going to be threatened. If you, this is something we saw in the run up to the 1800 election. It's something, if you look at Europe in the 20s and 30s, if you look at Latin America in the 60s and 70s, you got to this point where one party decides that it simply cannot afford to allow the other party to win. And we're not far from there, quite frankly. One difference between the two parties, though, which you also pointed to, is that only one party is on the brink of nominating a presidential candidate who is openly authoritarian. So if I was worried about Trump back in 2016, Republicans could perhaps be forgiven for not seeing the threat in Trump in 2016. He hadn't been president. A lot of people thought he would moderate once he was in office, that he would have to kind of become more presidential, and that the institutions would constrain him. We now know, everybody in the United States now knows what Donald Trump represents, right? He's shown all of his colors. He is now an openly authoritarian figure who has a track record of trying to overturn the results of an election, right? There are few things in a democracy that you can do that's more nakedly undemocratic than trying to overturn the results of an election. Trump did it. He's open about it. And the Republican Party, nevertheless, is pretty darn close to unanimous in being willing to go forward with him as a candidate. And so that poses a direct threat to our democracy.
Why has the reaction to growing diversity in the United States been unusually authoritarian, whereas in Western Europe, the rise of xenophobic and anti-establishment parties have rarely taken on the overtly anti-democratic form that we've seen here in the United States?
I don't think we know for sure. There are at least two possibilities. One is the transition to multiracial democracy is more advanced in the United States than it is in Western Europe. This phenomenon of a dominant founding ethnic majority potentially losing its numerical majority and its dominant status, that's much further along in the United States than anywhere else in Europe. Europe has become much, much, much more diverse through immigration over the last 30 or 40 years. But in no place do you have the degree of diversity that we have in the United States. So it could be that the United States is just further along, and that the kind of authoritarian reaction we see in the United States is coming in 10 or 20 years in Europe. It may be as well, though, that the United States' relative unique history with respect to slavery and anti-Black racism makes the United States distinct from what we're seeing in Europe. I don't think we know yet. There's a third difference, though, which is the type of electoral and constitutional system they have in Western Europe. In parliamentary democracies with proportional representation election systems, far-right parties get somewhere between 10 and 20, 25% of the vote. They're growing, they're important, they're scary in many ways, but they represent a minority, and they get, because of the nature of the electoral system, they get a minority of the vote. And so they can't govern alone. Nowhere in Europe has a far-right party governed alone. What they do is either they're in opposition, like in France and Germany, or they come to power as part of a coalition government, like we've seen in Scandinavia at times, like we've seen in Austria, like we're now seeing in Italy. But no, because of the nature of the political system, parties that represent a sort of radicalized 25% can't govern alone. So they can't do as much damage. In the United States, because of the pretty unique nature of our system, we have a two-party system, an electoral college that allows losers to win, a system of primaries that allows a plurality of a party to fully capture a party. Trumpism, MAGA, never represented anywhere near a majority of Americans, not even close. Maybe it's really not far from the roughly 25% that we see in Europe. But because of our electoral system, that 25% can capture a party and then capture the presidency. And so I think that institutional difference matters as well.
When I was thinking about the significance that you put on semi-loyalists in this book, I was also thinking about the issue of the Supreme Court being a galvanizing issue for a lot of folks who felt like they were an increasing minority. I'm specifically referring to the death of Antonin Scalia in February of 2016, when Mitch McConnell single-handedly blocked President Obama's pick for the replacement of Scalia, Merrick Garland, from even having a hearing in the Senate. And then, of course, Trump comes in 2017 and gets Neil Gorsuch confirmed. And Neil Gorsuch is, of course, followed by Brett Kavanaugh, and then Amy Coney Barrett in 2020 came after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You mentioned that this idea of democracy being in jeopardy is far more than the time period between 2016 and 2021. This has been going on a little bit before that. Can you highlight some of the significance of the battle of the Supreme Court and control of the federal courts and how that plays into the tyranny of the minority?
Sure. Let me say three things about that. In part, and this is something we deal with in greater detail on how democracies die. But getting back to what we were talking about earlier, extreme polarization and a perception that the other party represents an existential threat leads parties to start to bend and break the rules, to engage in what Danny and I call constitutional hardball. And the Republicans' behavior with respect to the Supreme Court, particularly with the Merrick Garland case that you mentioned, is a great example of that. It's an example of constitutional hardball in a context of extreme polarization. But it's worse than that. And there's an institutional problem as well. And that is a couple of things. We have a constitution that allows systematically partisan minorities to routinely thwart and even govern over majorities more than any other democracy on earth. So we're the only presidential democracy where the loser of the presidential vote can become president. We're one of the few democracies that has a legislative body like the Senate, where the makeup of the Senate is way out of proportion with the popular vote. And we're the only established democracy on earth where Supreme Court justices, appointments to the Supreme Court, are truly lifetime. There's no retirement age, and there's no term limits. So think of the very recent example, 2016, the loser of the popular vote wins the presidency. And the party that wins the popular vote for the Senate doesn't control the Senate. The loser of the popular vote wins control of the Senate, the Republicans. That minority president and that minority Senate goes on to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices, as you just mentioned, dramatically changing the character of the court. If the United States had a system like all other established democracies, where the winner of the popular vote for the presidency becomes the president, and the party that wins the most votes for the legislature controls the legislature, had we simply had a system of basic majority rule, we would probably have a 6-3 liberal Supreme Court today. That's how distortionary our institutions are. The one other thing I would say is one of the things that we call for in the book is term limits, probably 12 or 18-year term limits on the Supreme Court. If we had a system of term limits like many other established democracies, we wouldn't have it. There would be no possibility of the kind of crisis that happened around the Merrick Garland case, and it's more or less happening with every Supreme Court vacancy now, right? If we had a system of regular rotation on and off the court, each president would have, at least under one proposal, 2 appointments during her or his 4-year term. There would be no, blocking it or preventing it. They would have 2 appointments. And so the stakes would be dramatically lowered, and we'd be much, much less likely to have the kind of crisis that we're facing with each appointment now. So I think in addition to the Republicans becoming so radicalized that they're now tempted to bend or break the rules at every turn, we have a set of institutions that are making the problem much worse and need to be reformed.
One of the theories in your book, the dodge bullet theory, which alleges that America basically dodged a bullet by electing Joe Biden in 2020 instead of Donald Trump to a second term. You say that theory is misguided. Why was the threat facing American democracy never simply a strongman with a cult-like following? And what are the underlying problems facing American democracy?
2 of them in particular that we focus on in the book. One is, unfortunately, and this is a problem that's worse than we anticipated when we wrote How Democracies Die, the entire Republican Party has walked away from democracy. So this is not just Trump. Trump by himself wouldn't get very far in undermining American democracy. He's only capable of winning the presidency, and he's only capable of threatening or weakening or undermining American democracy if he has accomplices in his own party. And he does. The entire Republican Party, the vast bulk of Republican leaders, have shown over and over again that they're willing to, at best, remain silent in the face of his abuses, and in many cases justify, condone, protect him from efforts to hold him accountable for his abuses. So the Republican Party has shown itself willing to go along for the ride, and those who are not have either been purged or they've retired. They've left. Mitt Romney is one of the last. The other thing is, we were just talking about, is our institutions are reinforcing this problem. We have a set of institutions that protect and empower an authoritarian minority party. If the Republican Party needed to win a majority, a national majority, 50+1% of Americans, to actually exercise power in the presidency, in the Senate, in the Supreme Court, they would be forced, or they would be under much, much more pressure to move beyond MAGA and actually appeal to a much broader base. And the day the Republicans do that, the day the Republicans are able to win national popular majorities, they'll become a less dangerous party, a less threatened party, and a more diverse party. And that's much better for our democracy.
You alluded to the departure of Mitt Romney, his announcement, which surprised many since this was his first term, that he would not seek a second term. If you could elaborate on the significance of that decision. And of course, we've seen others who have been willing to stand up to Trump, make their declaration of independence against Trump, and then decide to leave. You have Jeff Flake, you have Adam Kinzinger. What is the significance of people who stand up against this demagogue not remaining in power, choosing not to seek a second term, choosing not to fight for democracy in the capacity of an elected official? And could you also shed the light on whether it's hollow criticism that they're making now that they're no longer going to be a sitting member of Congress in another subsequent term?
Well, look, I think first and foremost, what the slow departure of figures like Jeff Flake and Bob Corker and Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and most recently Mitt Romney means, it's a clear demonstration of where the Republican Party is and where it's moving. It has thoroughly Trumpized. There is it shows, and it showed us repeatedly, that there's no space in the Republican Party for non-Trumpist figures, for honestly small d Democrats within the party. If you're not willing to countenance Trump's authoritarianism, you have no space in the party. And so that's the most important point. In terms of the other thing that's become clear, and Romney's another case of this, is as long as you aspire to a political future within the Republican Party, Republicans now know that they cannot question Trump, right? So the only Republicans who challenge Trump are those who know they're on their way out of politics. And that's another sign of just how thoroughly consolidated this authoritarian faction of the Republican Party is.
Well, Professor Levitsky, thank you so much. This was a wonderful discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And again, the name of the book, The Tyranny of the Minority. Wonderful to read. Excellent, informative text. Enjoyed talking about it with you again, Professor. And again, I just want to always leave an open invitation to come back on the platform. We love listening to you, sir.
It's always a pleasure, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
With that being said, that'll conclude episode 119 of the Political Mike podcast. Thank you, Professor.
Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mike podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePollyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.